At the end of the last video, I said that the richer the metadata record, the better it serves the function of resource discovery. And that's reasonable on the face of it, but it's very trusting of me, right? I'm trusting that the values in the metadata record are accurate. Now, I trust Europeana. I trust that their harvester is well written so that it's harvesting a good copy of the metadata record, not corrupted in any way. And I trust the British Library, which you remember is where this resource is from. I trust the British Library to have very high standards for their metadata creation. But let's face it, accidents happen. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that someone made a typo in creating this metadata record. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that someone misspelled the word Indian in this metadata record. So if you were searching for items about India, which is of course spelled I-N-D-I-A, you wouldn't retrieve this record because you have two letters transposed. So a very simple typo just broke this metadata record for the purpose of resource discovery. So now let's look at the name authority entry for Mark Twain, for example. And this record is from the National Library of Australia, although I believe this record is derived from the Library of Congress's name authority file. So why are we looking at an American author's name authority entry on the National Library of Australia? Well, I'll tell you, because at the moment, in the United States, right now when I'm filming this video, we're in the middle of a government shutdown. The federal government is shut down, and so the Library of Congress's web servers are offline. So I can't show you this on the Library of Congress's website. So I would just like to say thank you very much, National Library of Australia. Also, it occurs to me I should probably have chosen an Australian author as an example here, but perhaps this just pegs me as an ugly American, but I don't know any Australian authors that write under a pseudonym, so forgive me, all you Australians out there. At any rate, what I want to show you is that in this entry for Mark Twain, we have all of these variant spellings, and we have all of these see alsos, some other names, some other pseudonyms that Mark Twain wrote under, and then of course Samuel Clemens was his actual name. If I were a non-English speaker searching for works by Mark Twain, I might search using one of these alternate spellings, and then I wouldn't retrieve all of the other works by Mark Twain where that name was spelled differently. Or even, if I spelled Twain T-W-A-I-N, I might not retrieve materials about Samuel Clemens or any of the other pseudonyms that Mark Twain used. The name authority record, though, ties all those names together and makes it clear that they all refer to one entity, this one author who wrote under several names. Consistency is an important evaluation criterion, especially where names and jargon are being used, because one, you have the risk of misspellings and typos, and two, variant spellings and differences in the spelling of names across languages, etc. On the other hand, terms change over time. In particular, subject headings change. As knowledge of the world changes, the controlled vocabularies that represent knowledge about the world have to change to keep up. Now, there's a really excellent book by Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr called Sorting Things Out that discusses this explicitly. In particular, they discuss the evolution of terms used in medicine, not just the medical subject headings, mesh, but all kinds of terms used in diagnoses, used by doctors over the course of, the last 150 years or so. Those terms have changed over time as medical knowledge has changed. And the point that Bowker and Starr make is that classification schemes are cultural artifacts. They reflect the culture and the worldview of the people who created them. So remember way back in Unit 1, when I was talking about what information science is, and I said that information science has an area of study called human-computer interaction. And I also said that in computer science, that same thing is often called computer-human interaction. Well, there you have a really beautiful comparison. What comes first when you talk about that thing? What you call a thing says a lot about how you think about it. So in the book, Sorting Things Out, the authors, Bowker and Starr, use the example of hysteria. Now, that used to be a diagnosis that a doctor might make, but not anymore, right? In fact, if we search the medical subject headings, MESH, for hysteria, what we see is that it's explicitly listed as a historic term not used in contemporary practice. It's still listed as an entry in the medical subject headings, but it's explicitly stated to be for historical use only. But what if you were doing research on the history of medicine, which is a very large and interesting area of study, right? You might actually want to search for resources about hysteria, but what I think you would probably find is that over time, that diagnosis would fall out of use. And then what would you search for? What would a doctor today call the condition, or conditions more likely, that 100 years ago might have been diagnosed as hysteria? The flip side of that, of a term falling out of use, is a term coming into existence. And the example that Bowker and Starr use is post-traumatic stress disorder, which was only made a term in MESH after the Vietnam War. So what, again, if you were doing research on the history of medicine, what would you search for prior to the mid to late 1960s? If you wanted to do research on the history of post-traumatic stress disorder, well, it wasn't called that in 1918, but let's face it, World War I was a pretty traumatic war for a lot of people. So post-traumatic stress disorder was called what exactly? Terminology changes over time as the view of the world that terminology reflects changes over time. Sorting things out makes for really interesting reading if you find that kind of evolution of linguistics as reflecting worldview to be an interesting topic. Because it makes clear that the way that we represent knowledge, the way we make maps, and remember, the map is not the territory, the way we organize information about the world says a lot about the way we think about the world. The problem is that means that the values that we assign to elements in metadata records are also going to change over time. Even the values that we intend to mean more or less the same thing, or it might be more accurate to say values that we intend to refer to the same thing in the world. The term that we use to refer to that thing in the world may change over time. So to finally loop back around to the topic of the evaluation of metadata, the values that are provided in metadata records may be a great access point today, but not so much in the future. Or the values in a metadata record may be great access points for one community, that's familiar with a particular jargon and set of terms, but not so great for others outside of that community. Which brings me to the topic of provenance. Where do metadata terms come from?